moving on to talk about depressive disorders. Depression is certainly the most commonly experienced psychological disorder, and as such, there's been a ton of research devoted to it. We have a really healthy understanding of what constitutes depression, how to treat depression, and different classifications of depression. So we call depression the quote unquote common cold of all mental disorders. It's the number one reason people seek mental health services. Now, depression does have various comorbidities with them. So, for example, many individuals with depression also have anxiety, but not everyone. Depression, in and of itself, is the most common psychological illness that people deal with, and the number one reason people seek mental health services. This recurring theme of a psychological illness needing to rise above the level of normal negative feelings, this is the same concept. We all get sad sometimes, and we all get down and sad when bad things happen in our life. That's completely normal. Just being sad doesn't necessarily mean that you have depression. So, what categorizes a depressive disorder is, again, the level of distress that one experiences and just how much dysfunction it visits upon your life. So, whereas any individual might become temporarily sad some of the time, depression is going to be persistent and it's going to cause a lot more distress and be a lot more difficult for people to deal with. So, various categories of depressive disorders. One is your major depressive disorder. A slightly distinct manifestation of depression is your persistent depressive disorder, and another slightly distinct manifestation is your seasonal affective disorder, or your SAD. Major depressive disorder is certainly going to be your most commonly experienced depressive disorder that individuals tend to present. So, starting with MDD, major depressive disorder is constituted by an individual who suffers from a depressed mood a lot of the time. So basically, feeling sad most of the day, and additionally, a marked diminished interest or pleasure in activities. A word that we use for this symptom is what we call anhedonia. This basically means an inability to feel pleasure or happiness. So you're not just sad, you're unable to gain happiness or enjoyment from the things that maybe you used to enjoy. You sort of feel numb and you don't actually get those positive feelings out of doing things that you used to be interested in or that made you happy. Additionally, you see some physical characteristics of MDD. Interestingly, though, a lot of the physical characteristics can go in opposite directions, and both would constitute a symptom of depression. So, for example, you tend to see appetite changes. Some individuals with MDD will lose a significant amount of weight because they lose their appetite. They don't get all the enjoyment from food that they used to, and as such, they don't eat as much and lose weight. On the other hand, some individuals with MDD will actually have more of an appetite, not even necessarily appetite. They might just turn to food because of all the distress that they feel. So some individuals with MDD will actually gain weight. So this idea of someone being very sad and wasting away, some individuals actually gain weight. Additionally, you see changes to sleep patterns. Again, this can go in opposite directions and still be considered a symptom of depression. So, some people experience insomnia, meaning that they actually can't sleep as much as they used to. Other individuals, on the other hand, might sleep too much. So, again, this idea of someone with MDD being in bed all day, some individuals that's what it looks like, but not everyone. Some individuals with MDD actually find more of a sleep disturbance or disruption. Again, you might have the physical manifestation of your tiredness making you lethargic or sleepy or sluggish, or you might see someone who becomes a little bit more tense and physically agitated. Again, this might seem confusing. This is mostly just the idea that every individual with depression is going to have their illness manifest in a way specific to them. Further symptoms: fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, feelings of worthlessness and feelings of guilt associated with that. So, feeling like you're a huge burden on your loved ones and you're not worth their care or love. Daily problems in thinking, concentrating, and making decisions. So, you actually see some cognitive issues arise with MDD based on the persistent negative mood and the difficulty concentrating because of your obsessive thoughts and rumination of how bad you feel. This can cause a little bit of a cognitive disturbance. So, a lot of individuals with depression really have a hard time focusing on accomplishing daily tasks. It might even be all someone with MDD can do to concentrate to take a shower or do any sort of task in the household. Additionally, many individuals with MDD have recurring thoughts of suicide and of dying. Not everyone with MDD experiences suicidality. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Many individuals with MDD do, though, and this is definitely one of the most severe symptoms that individuals with depression can experience. Someone with depression that manifests in suicidality is a very dangerous indication that they might harm themselves. So, as you can see, the diagnostic criteria has three or more of these symptoms occurring. And again, they need to be present for a certain amount of time to indicate that the persistence of the experiences rise to the level of an MDD diagnosis. So, again, based on the fact that you only need three out of this much longer list, again, two individuals with MDD might present with very, very different experiences of that disorder. So the symptoms must be present for at least 2 weeks to indicate that someone is in the midst of a major depressive episode. So you can have gone through a major depressive episode just having these symptoms for 2 weeks. That's definitely on the low end. The average duration for a major depressive episode is going to be 6 months before a person sees the other side. Now, not every individual with depression needs treatment. It can naturally improve over the course of time. You might be feeling down for a few weeks because something is going on in your life and it might reach the threshold of diagnostic criteria. And you might just naturally get better. So, some individuals with more mild cases of depression, they can naturally get better, maybe when some experiences or circumstances in their life turn around. So, it can get better and doesn't always need treatment. Additionally, there's things that individuals with depression are advised to do, subtle changes to your lifestyle that can be helpful. Something as simple as encouraging regular exercise can definitely help boost mood. So there's things that individuals can do. Often, MDD is going to be experienced at the onset of a stressful life event. So, something that's not traumatic, but just highly stressful. So, a lot of stress at work, for example. Something like a marriage, which most people would think of as a happy event. As I discussed when I mentioned stress, anything that's a major change could be considered a stressful event. So, maybe going away to college, which a lot of individuals likely thought of as a happy development, it's such a big change and maybe leaves you feeling a little bit alone and isolated. A lot of individuals moving away to college, even if it was what they wanted to do, might experience a bout of depression. Some individuals might experience MDD when they experience a trauma. Maybe it would be comorbid with PTSD, not always. For some individuals who are highly predisposed to depression, on the other hand, even just daily stressors, experiencing those low level hassles day to day, that could precipitate the onset of a depressive episode. So often it is the case that external circumstances do lead to the development of depression. A lot of times, when things in life sort of settle down, the individual might naturally come to see the other side of the depressive episode without necessarily needing any long term treatment plan. Persistent depressive disorder is a distinct manifestation of depression that's less common and a bit more severe. So, PDD or dysthymia, this is going to be when a major depressive episode basically lasts for a much longer period of time, so for at least 2 years. So, this is going to be individuals who are depressed for years at a time. As I mentioned, the typical average duration of a major depressive episode is 6 months, so that's going to be the average. There are some individuals who continue to struggle with depression for years. Now, this is not going to be as severely depressed, but it is much more of a long term sort of an illness. So you don't see the sort of acute severity of a major depressive episode, but it's very ongoing and lasts for a very long time. The diagnostic criteria would have individuals suffering from at least two of the following symptoms. And again, it's basically going to be the same list of symptoms that an individual with depression might experience. So, again, it's mostly a distinction of the severity. So, you can only have two symptoms from this list, but you need to have them for a much longer period of time. Seasonal affective disorder, it is a real thing that people get more depressed in the winter. Not every individual who feels sad during the long, dark, cold winter months develops seasonal affective disorder or SAD, but it is a particular way that depression can manifest that does see the onset of a depressive episode specifically in association with the winter months. So, this is going to be typically a recurrent seasonal pattern of depression whereby an individual really exclusively has the bout of depression in the winter months. An interesting thing to note about seasonal affective disorder is that it is very much driven by the seasons. It does get better when the season changes. It can actually be improved. Some research indicates, for example, it can be improved with light therapy. So it really does have something to do with the dark, cold winter months. And again, it's normal for all of us to get a little bit down in the dark, cold winter months. Seasonal affective disorder is going to be where an individual specifically experiences a depressive episode exhibiting symptoms from the previous list of symptoms I showed you for MDD, but specifically it is onset regularly during winter. Generally, mood disorders are going to be more common in young individuals and in particular women. You may be aware of the fact that women exhibit higher levels of depression and anxiety. This research is universal and pretty consistent. You do tend to see that women are going to be more likely to suffer from a mood disorder. Additionally, you do tend to see younger individuals more likely to suffer from a mood disorder. And as you can see, rates of mood disorders in different countries does vary. Again, United States, we're still number one. Country to country, you tend to see this pattern occurring in different cultures. Now, there's a lot of research on the biological predisposition of depression. We know a fair amount about ways that your biology can predispose you to the development of depression. Not everyone who has a genetic predisposition for depression will become depressed. Often, a stressful event needs to precipitate that depressive episode, but we do know that certain individuals carry genetic predispositions for depression. So, for example, some really cool DNA research has found that there's particular genes that have been isolated that are associated with the likelihood of developing depression. Additionally, twin studies, which we often use to try and understand just how much shared genetics contribute to distinct or similar outcomes. The idea is twins having identical genetic makeup can help us disentangle just how much genetics are bringing a predisposition to the table versus how much different twins who have been adopted into different environments experience different rates of something. So basically, if two twins adopted into different environments still tend to experience the same psychological consequences, you would say that that's likely a genetic component. If two twins adopted into different environments don't have the same experience, we would likely think that whatever that characteristic we're trying to understand is mostly driven by environmental factors. So, this sort of research has taken place in many different disorders. So, in terms of genetics having a strong pull over depression, as you can see, it's not the highest. There is a great amount of genetic predisposition. So, somewhere around 40% of the likelihood of developing depression comes down to your genes. But as you can see, it's definitely not everything. Individuals who do have the genetic predisposition to develop depression often will need to have, again, a stressful precipitating event before experiencing an actual illness of depression. As you can see, bipolar and schizophrenia are much, much more genetically driven. Depression sees changes occur in your brain. Overall, you see global diminished brain activity in individuals with depression. Your body is sort of shutting down your brain activity. You might think that this is counterintuitive because people with depression often experience rumination, so a sort of a nonstop cascade of negative thoughts. The brain actually demonstrates that it's an overall diminished brain activity. You see changes to the structure of the frontal lobes, whereby individuals with depression have a smaller amount of that frontal lobe space. And you definitely see distinct patterns of neurotransmitter communication in the brain. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is greatly associated with the experience of depression, and as such, you definitely see serotonin based medical treatments. So, you do definitely see reduced levels of serotonin, a neurotransmitter known to be important for the experience of happiness and mood maintenance. Additionally, you see less norepinephrine, similarly, another neurotransmitter that's associated with mood. Oh, there's a video here. I encourage you to watch it in your own time. I'm not going to watch it right now because I don't have time. I'm trying to get out of here. Right? So I encourage you to watch the video. It's a brief video on the biology of depression, which is very interesting. Okay, so some general theoretical perspectives on depression exist to help us understand the way depression is experienced and who is likely to develop it. So, the social cognitive perspective, which is interested in understanding the way that thought patterns and social experiences shape the likelihood of depression and the way it's experienced, has found that depression is associated with a series of psychological experiences. One is going to be the presentation of a low sense of self esteem. So, individuals with depression are very likely to discount all the positive information about themselves, which typically non depressed individuals use positive information about themselves and are very likely to absorb it because of this self enhancement bias. Depressed individuals don't have so much of that self enhancement bias. They're a lot more likely to discount positive information they hear about themselves and assume the worst about themselves and the world in general. So, for example, an individual with depression, let's say they take an exam and do well at it, most people would take that as indicative that you're smart or that you're successful. An individual with depression is likely going to discount that and say that maybe they just got lucky. The experience of learned helplessness is greatly associated with the experience of depression. So, this is going to categorize any number of self defeating beliefs that someone is unable to experience happiness. So, individuals with depression, anyone who's ever experienced depression or known someone with it, can find it honestly very, very frustrating. The idea is that people need to want to help themselves to get better. Now, ironically, depression is associated with a diminished ability to believe in your capacity to improve. So, people with depression aren't trying to be frustrating just because. It's really because depression is associated with these helplessness beliefs. The idea that you are destined to be unhappy and there's no way that you can get through this depression. And that helps the depressive episode persist. I've mentioned this word rumination before. What that means is a specific sort of a cognitive way that depressive thoughts tend to work. So rumination basically means a obsessive revisiting of negative thoughts and memories. So rumination is really this stuck sort of focus on bad information. So individuals with depression sort of get stuck in their own head and obsessive about all the bad things in their life. They might be stuck obsessing about all the ways in which they've embarrassed themselves, or done things that didn't end up well, or times when they didn't have great social interactions. Just anytime anything bad happens, you get stuck focusing on that and you really can't get it out of your head. So, all of these features basically describe the cognitive world that individuals with depression are living in. They don't feel good about themselves. They're stuck obsessing on all the worst things about themselves and their lives, and a genuine belief that there's no way that they can ever get better. Again, depression is frustrating. to suffer with it or to know someone suffering with it, you just think to yourself that you could just focus on the good things in life and feel better. It's really not that simple. People with depression really have all of these cognitive factors working against them, making it hard to feel like you can improve. Now, another important aspect of this social cognitive perspective on depression is what we call the depressive explanatory style. So I've talked about explanatory styles before. If you remember when I talked about attribution theory from social psychology, I identified what's called the fundamental attribution error, whereby we have a specific explanatory or attribution style that helps us build ourselves up and maybe discount in other people the extent to which their behaviors is due to circumstances. Depression is actually categorized by a completely different attribution style that looks a little bit more like this. Individuals with a depressive explanatory style, as opposed to taking in information that reflects well on them and discounting the information that reflects poorly, they actually explain things in the opposite way. So, for example, let's take what is pretty universally considered to be a negative life event. So let's say you're broken up with by your romantic partner. This is something that often bums people out because it's just a negative experience, but we've all sort of been there. What would constitute a depressive explanatory style in response to this particular negative event versus someone who's not suffering from depression? So, one thing has to do with identifying the nature of the problem. Individuals with depression are a lot more likely to think that a problem is stable, meaning that basically it'll never get better. So, whereas an individual who's not depressed might take this negative experience and think, I'm going to be able to get through this. It's going to feel bad for a while, but I am going to get through this. Individuals with depression are a lot more likely to genuinely believe that they'll never be able to get over this problematic event. Additionally, their attribution about the nature of the problem is global as opposed to specific. So, whereas someone who's not depressed might think to themselves, it's okay, this is a negative event, but the whole world's not coming crashing down. I have other things in my life that I can rely on. I have other social support. There are other things in my life that I can focus on. This is a problem that's specific to this problem. Individuals with depression are a lot more likely to say that the problem has to do with the entire world, that the problem indicates that the entire world is messed up and it's because of them. Additionally, internal versus external attributions. Again, this harkens back to that attribution theory that I mentioned when talking about social psychology. Individuals with depression who experience a negative event are a lot more likely to have an internal attribution about the event. So, whereas people without depression are a lot more likely to make the fundamental attribution error, whereby we tend to take an external attribution approach to any negative information about ourselves, individuals with depression are a lot more likely to make essentially a fundamental attribution error targeted at themselves, where you basically assume that the cause of any problem in your life is because of your internal failings. So, again, depression is frustrating. This is an explanatory style that people with depression tend to develop based on the way that their depression is unfolding in their lives. But I don't think anyone would assume that this is a pleasant sort of a cognitive world to live in. Yes, it is frustrating to be depressed, but that's because there are all of these really horrible thoughts whirling around in your mind all the time that you genuinely believe are true. Okay, so overall, that explanatory pattern on the left, you're going to see individuals with depression either already having this explanatory style and it precipitates or precedes the depressive episode. Additionally, you sometimes see individuals with depression develop this explanatory style. So whether or not this explanatory style causes or is the result of depression, that's not quite as clear. Additionally, depression is frustrating because it really gets people into a series of really pernicious, self fulfilling prophecies and really creates a bit of a vicious cycle. So, the changes that a person experiences when they are in the midst of a depressive episode, it makes it more likely that stressful experiences are going to occur. So often a stressful event precipitates the beginning of depression, but once someone is depressed, it's a lot more likely that they're going to continue to experience these stressors. You see, individuals with depression are a lot more likely to get divorced or to lose their job. Again, you could imagine that these events might result because of someone's depression, right? It's frustrating to be in a relationship with someone who's depressed. Someone who's depressed might not be the best employee. But as you can imagine, if you're already in the midst of a depressive episode and then you lose your job, again, think about how that would just perpetuate the experience of depression. So that's partly why it's really hard to pull yourself out of a depressive cycle. So, this self fulfilling prophecy, it's not necessarily self fulfilling, it's mostly a vicious cycle. It's basically that individuals with depression have certain changes to the way they interact, and it makes it more likely that they're going to experience events that will precipitate and perpetuate their depression. Now, a conversation with depression does bring in the relevant topic of suicide. Not every individual with depression is suicidal or tries to commit suicide, but it certainly is a symptom that presents in some of the most severe cases. So we really do need to care about suicide. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, according to the CDC. Suicide does take a lot of the lives of individuals in this country, and so it does need to belong in the same conversation as strokes and heart disease. Individuals are at the greatest risk of becoming suicidal or attempting suicide when they're rebounding from a depressive episode. This is actually because individuals are in the sort of worst of their depression, that lethargy, that sort of down state, actually tends to be associated with a difficulty trying to do anything. Suicidal ideation and attempts are included. So actually, people don't tend to be at most risk of killing themselves when they're at the sort of the worst point of their depression. It's when they start getting a little bit better and start getting a little bit more energy back that you see someone at greatest risk for suicide. So you might think suicidal risk is at the height when someone is the most depressed. It's actually when they're starting to feel better that you see risk of attempts. Additionally, I mentioned that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. If you're talking about young adults, so from the age of 15 to 24, you see that number considerably higher. So individuals between the age of 15 to 24, they're a lot less likely to die from heart disease, stroke, etc. So something like suicide is actually a lot more dangerous when you're looking at a younger age group. You do see that suicidal attempts, ideation, and completion do change throughout the lifespan. In terms of the relationship between gender and suicidality, counterintuitively, women actually are more likely to attempt suicide than men. You might think that there would be a gender difference whereby men are more likely to attempt suicide because the rates of completed suicide in men are so much higher. This actually is most likely due to the different ways that men and women tend to try and complete a suicide attempt. Men are much more likely to choose more lethal methods, including death by shooting yourself or by hanging. Women are much more likely to attempt suicide, but they're actually less likely to complete it because they're more often going to try to, for example, overdose on a medication. In terms of why men and women are susceptible to these different approaches for suicide, we can't really know for sure. Perhaps women who are feeling suicidal feel more guilt about leaving a really messy scene for people to clean up, and as such, they want to take approaches to attempting suicide that are going to be a lot less traumatic for people who have to come and clean it up. Sorry, this is so grim, but this is really the way that the topic of suicide goes. Overall, we can't know exactly why suicidal behavior manifests differently in men versus women, but the overall numbers indicate that women are more likely to attempt, but men are more likely to complete the act. Additionally, there's a bit of a public contagion effect of public suicide. So actually, you see When a high profile individual commits suicide, you do tend to see public suicide rates increase. Whether it's because people already feeling suicidal sort of see that as a model for how they can complete their attempt. Again, we can't quite know, but we do know that it's important to raise awareness about suicide and understand that publicizing suicide attempts can be really damaging to people. One of the most influential theories about suicidal ideation is what we call the interpersonal psychological theory of suicidal behavior. So, this is a very famous theory, most associated with the clinical psychologist Dr. Thomas Joyner. He developed this theory as basically the idea that suicide is going to be something that's actually really hard for people to get to that point. A lot of factors in someone's life need to come together to make the likelihood of suicide occur. His theory greatly highlights the idea that suicide is not something that we should look at with shame, and we shouldn't shame people who are experiencing suicidal, and we really shouldn't necessarily blame people who commit suicide for their own failings, because that just precipitates a really negative stigma about suicidal ideation, and it might make it so that people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts don't seek help because they know there's such a stigma associated with it. So, a more nuanced and sympathetic understanding of just how much someone needs to be struggling before they would try to attempt suicide, and his theory looks like this. One factor that is theorized to need to be present before one might attempt suicide is thwarted belongingness. So we've talked about thwarted belongingness again when we talked about social psychology. This is the idea that being excluded, isolated, or ostracized is very, very painful. We're social creatures, and as such, feeling like you don't have that belongingness need met is highly detrimental to our psychological health and well-being. Individuals who may be at risk for suicide perceive themselves to be a burden on other people. The idea that you are a pain, that you are just something that someone else needs to deal with, and that you're really just putting a burden on your loved ones. Again, think about how awful this sort of an experience must be. Someone genuinely believes that the world would be a better place if they weren't there. They genuinely believe that their loved ones would be better off if they weren't there. This is such a horrible thing to feel. Individuals who are depressed and who are experiencing suicidality as a symptom greatly report that they think that they are nothing but a burden on other people and that everyone would be better off if they weren't there. Now, to have thwarted belonging and to perceive yourself as a burden on other people, those two things, as unpleasant as they may be, according to the theory, are not enough to drive someone to actually try and commit suicide. These are going to be experiences associated with depression for sure, but a last piece of the theory predicts that an individual needs to acquire a capability of committing suicide. To commit suicide comes against our natural predisposition, our evolutionary drive to survive. So, what makes someone capable of a suicidal act? It needs to go sort of beyond these emotional and psychological factors. Someone needs to be capable of suicide by having a high pain tolerance and threshold and by overcoming their own fear of death, at least enough to commit the act. So, again, think about how much of a horrible experience that is to have this thwarted belongingness, this perceived burdensomeness, and to also have the capability of committing the act. Now, again, according to the theory, all of these factors need to be present before someone may attempt to take their own lives. They need to have all these factors present. Again, one important implication of this theory is that I really think it encourages us to think more sympathetically about just what someone must be struggling with before they attempt to commit suicide. Society so looks down on individuals who are feeling suicidal, and particularly against individuals who have a successful suicide attempt, that I think is really overall, in my opinion, damaging. I think we need to understand just how much people who feel suicidal are struggling, because that is how we encourage people to get treatment. In terms of research that has looked into just which one of these factors appear to be the most impactful, data broken down by the extent to which individuals perceive themselves as a burden really indicates that it's the perceived burdensomeness that is the critical factor that tends to be associated with actually enacting a suicide attempt. So even if an individual is feeling thwarted belongingness, and even if they have the acquired capability of suicide, it's really not until they genuinely feel that they are a burden on other people and that the world would be a better place without them, that you tend to see that likelihood of suicidality jump quite a bit. So it's really important to understand that the burdensomeness piece is likely the most impactful point in terms of being associated with the likelihood of becoming suicidal, because this gives us an idea that it's maybe the burdensome piece that should be most directed in maybe therapy or in the way that we treat these individuals. Now, the topic of non suicidal self injury is quite distinct from any sort of suicidal attempts or completions. This is a behavior that is associated with individuals who might not be feeling suicidal whatsoever. So this is your self-injury that does not have the goal of suicide. So any sort of cutting or burning yourself or pulling out hair, this is a quite distinct manifestation of a mood disorder than actual suicidality. So this is behavior that's meant to hurt yourself but not kill yourself. So this is quite distinct from suicidal behavior, and as such really needs to be treated quite differently. The vast majority of people who injure themselves in this way are not actually trying to kill themselves, and it usually does not lead to suicide. This is a behavior that you do definitely tend to see expressed more often in women, and you do tend to see that behavior largely exclusive to teenaged individuals. Not universally, there are individuals outside of this age range that might engage in these behaviors, but this is definitely something that we understand to be mostly associated with this adolescent period. So again, this is completely distinct from suicidal behavior. It does tend to be associated with mood disorders, but it is completely distinct from suicidality. Again, I think it's important to understand that this behavior is quite distinct, and as such, it needs to be treated differently than someone who's actually attempting to commit suicide. So I'm going to leave it there with the section on depressive disorders and pick back up with bipolar.